Sign it, or I will make sure you never see a dime of what's yours." My brother said that to me at our father's kitchen table, 3 days after the funeral. Not in anger. In the same flat, patient tone he used when he was explaining something he considered obvious. The way you talk to someone you've already decided doesn't matter. I didn't sign. I want to tell you what happened after that. But to understand it, you have to understand what it was like to grow up the second child in a house where the first one had already taken up all the oxygen. My brother is 4 years older than me. His name is Garrett. Growing up, Garrett was the kind of kid adults described as driven, which in our family meant he never stopped reminding everyone around him what he wanted and exactly how much he deserved it. My father called it ambition. My mother, before she left when I was 9, called it exhausting. I didn't have a word for it back then. I just knew that when Garrett was in the room, I disappeared. I was the quiet one, the one who got good grades without being asked, who never caused a scene at dinner, who learned early that making myself small was the fastest way to keep the peace. I became a physical therapist in my late 20s, which my father respected in a vague, distant way. "That's a good stable job," he said, "the way you'd compliment someone on a sensible car." But Garrett had gone into finance and had the salary to prove it, and that was the thing my father actually lit up about. My husband, Miles, saw it the first time he came to Thanksgiving. He pulled me aside in the kitchen afterward and said quietly, "Does your dad know you exist?" I laughed it off, but I thought about it for a long time after. My father's name was Harold. He was a retired civil engineer who'd built a life in Akron, Ohio, a 3-bedroom house he'd owned outright since 1999, a small rental property 2 miles away, and a brokerage account that, as we would eventually learn, held just over $400,000. Not generational wealth by any standard, but enough to matter, enough to fight over apparently. He had a will. He'd told both of us he had a will. He told us it was fair. He died in February, a Tuesday, of a second heart attack that came 6 weeks after the first one we thought he'd recovered from. I was with him. Garrett was in Chicago for a work trip he said he couldn't leave early. I held my father's hand in the hospital room and I listened to him breathe and then I listened to him stop. The will went to probate 3 weeks later. That's when everything I thought I understood about my family turned out to be a draft someone had edited without telling me. The attorney's name was Mr. Fielding. He had an office in downtown Akron with diplomas on the wall and a way of speaking that made everything sound already settled. Garrett sat across from me in one of the leather chairs. He was in a suit. I was still wearing the clothes I'd driven 4 hours in that morning. Mr. Fielding read the will. The house went to Garrett. The rental property went to Garrett. The brokerage account split 60% to Garrett, 40% to me. I didn't react right away. I think I just sat there processing, waiting for the part where it made sense. "Is there a more recent version?" I asked. He told me last spring he'd updated it. Mr. Fielding looked at Garrett before he looked at me. Just a fraction of a second. But I caught it. "This is the most recent document on file," he said. I looked at my brother. He was already gathering his copy into a folder. That night, I sat at the kitchen table in my father's house. Technically Garrett's house now, and I went through everything I could remember. My father had called me in April. He'd said specifically, "I'm having the will redone. I want things to be equal." He'd said equal. I remembered it because it surprised me. My father wasn't a man who used words carelessly. I called Miles. He drove up that night, arrived at 11:30 with coffee and a look on his face that meant he was worried, but wasn't going to say it yet. "Something's wrong," I said. "Tell me," he said. So I did. The conversation with Garrett happened 2 days later at the same kitchen table. Miles was in the other room. I'd asked him to stay close. Garrett sat down with a mug of coffee like we were about to discuss something routine. He had this way of settling into a chair that made it seem like the room had been waiting for him. "I need to understand the will," I said. "Dad told me he was changing it." Garrett looked at me with something I can only describe as practiced patience. "Dad changed his mind," he said. "He talked to me about it. He decided the house and the rental made more sense under single ownership. Less complicated, he told me equal. He told you a lot of things, Addie. That's my name. Adelaide. Everyone calls me Addie. When Garrett said it like that, flat, almost dismissive, I felt something shift in my chest. Not hurt, exactly. Something colder. I want to see the original, I said. The updated version he mentioned. I want to see when this will was actually signed. Garrett set his mug down. You're welcome to talk to Mr. Fielding. I will. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said calmly, sign the transfer documents for the rental property and I'll give you your 40% without contesting anything. Make this complicated and I'll tie it up in court for 2 years. You know what legal fees do to an estate. That was when he said it. Sign it. Or I will make sure you never see a dime of what's yours. I left the kitchen. I went into the bathroom and I turned on the faucet and I stood there with my hands on the sink for about 3 minutes. Then I came out and I told Miles everything. He said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to know what actually happened to that will. Miles is not a lawyer, but he is meticulous and he is patient, and he loves me in the specific way that means he doesn't try to solve things for me. He just stands next to me while I figure it out myself. He found an estate attorney in Akron named Ms. Mutt Prokop, who had 20 years of probate experience and a reputation for not backing down. I called her the next morning. Her first question was, do you have any documentation of your father's intent to update the will? I thought about it. Then I remembered the email. My father was not a big emailer. He called mostly. But in April, after our phone conversation, he'd sent me a message. I'd even thought it was unusual at the time, because he almost never wrote things down. It said, spoke to Fielding today. Told him what we discussed. Splitting things down the middle. Wanted you to know. That was it. 6 sentences in his way. But it was dated. It was in my inbox. And it was, Miss Prokop told me, significant. She filed a formal challenge to the will. What came out over the next 6 weeks was not what I expected. I had expected to feel vindicated or to feel foolish, one or the other. Instead, I felt like I was watching a house I thought I knew get taken apart wall by wall and finding different rooms behind each one. The notary who had witnessed my father's will had moved to another state, standard enough. But when Miss Prokop traced the timeline of when the will had been signed versus when Mr. Fielding claimed it had been submitted for filing, there was a gap. A gap of 11 days between April 14th and April 25th. My father's email to me was dated April 17th. Garrett had hired Mr. Fielding. He had, in fact, referred my father to Mr. Fielding 3 years earlier. They had a relationship. I didn't sleep well for most of March and April. Miles would wake up at 2 in the morning and find me on the couch with my laptop, going through emails, bank records, everything I could access. He'd bring me a glass of water and sit with me without saying anything. That quiet was one of the kindest things anyone has ever given me. At the deposition, Garrett was composed. He had his own attorney. Expensive, from Cleveland. He maintained that our father had discussed the revised split with him and had decided against it. He said my father had been going back and forth and had ultimately settled on what was fair given the circumstances. He said this with confidence. He'd had practice. But Ms. Prokop had found something. When she deposed Mr. Fielding, she asked about the 11-day gap. He fumbled. He said there had been a filing delay. She asked if the document had been in his possession during that delay. He said yes. She asked if anyone else had access to the document during that time. There was a long pause. He said Garrett reviewed a draft. The room got very quiet. Garrett had reviewed a draft of the will during the 11 days between when my father signed it and when it was officially submitted. A draft that, according to the original filing, did not match the signed document. My father had signed a version of the will that split everything equally. That document had been altered before filing. When Mrs. Prokop laid out the full timeline in her motion, the email, the gap, Fielding's deposition, the draft discrepancy, the court ordered a forensic document examination. It took 3 weeks. The results showed alterations consistent with a document that had been reprinted after original signatures were applied, with signatures transferred via a process the examiner described as reproduced rather than original. My father's signature had been copied. I was sitting in Ms. Prokop's office when she told me. Miles was next to me. I didn't cry. I'd been expecting it and not expecting it at the same time, the way you brace for something you've already felt in your bones. She said, "This is now a criminal matter." Garrett was charged with will fraud and forgery. Mr. Ribley Fielding surrendered his law license pending investigation and was charged as an accessory. The estate was frozen while the court sorted through what was legitimate and what wasn't. My brother called me once after the charges were filed. Just once. I didn't pick up. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand and I watched his name on the screen until it stopped. Miles asked if I wanted to call back. I said no. The criminal case moved slowly, the way those things do. What moved faster was the civil resolution. With the forensic evidence, the original will, equal split as my father had intended, was reinstated by the court. The house, the rental, the brokerage account. Split down the middle, exactly the way my father had told me in April, in a short email I almost hadn't saved. I kept that email in a folder on my desktop for the entire duration of the process. I read it sometimes, late at night. Not looking for evidence anymore, just to hear him. Garrett took a plea agreement, 18 months, reduced for cooperation. Mr. Fielding faced civil liability and disbarment. The estate settled in October, 11 months after my father died. I didn't go back to the house for a long time. When I finally did, Miles came with me. It was a gray afternoon, the kind Akron does well in the fall. The house smelled the same as it always had. Wood and something faintly like motor oil, the smell of a man who fixed things himself. I walked through the room slowly. I sat in my father's chair in the living room, the one by the window with the worn armrest on the left side where he always rested his elbow. I thought about the phone call in April. How he'd sounded tired but clear. How he'd said it, "I want things to be equal." Not as an apology exactly. More like a correction. Like he was trying to set something right that had been tilted for a long time. I think he knew, somewhere in him, that he hadn't always been equal. That the way he'd lit up for Garrett and gone quiet for me? He knew. He just didn't say it while he was alive. The way so many people wait too long to say the things that matter. He said it in April, through Mr. Fielding, in a will that someone decided to rewrite. They underestimated the email. They underestimated me. Miles and I are renting out the Akron house for now. The rental property is managed. We're not rich. But the money is real, and it's mine, and it was my father's actual wish. Not the one someone manufactured for him, but the one he chose in a clear moment when he decided to finally make things right. I go to work every day. I help people rebuild strength after injury, after surgery, after the thing that knocked them flat. I tell them that recovery isn't linear, that there are setbacks, that the work is slow and sometimes it doesn't feel like it's doing anything. And then, eventually, it does. The last thing my father ever said to me, in the hospital room before the morphine made conversation impossible, was, "You turned out all right, Eddie." He said it looking at the ceiling, not at me. In that way he had. Where the feeling was real but direct eye contact was too much for him. It was the most he'd ever said. I think about it more than anything else. More than the fraud, more than the courtroom, more than Garrett's voice on the phone telling me to sign. He knew. He tried to fix it. And when someone tried to undo that, I made sure they couldn't. That's all I did. I made sure they couldn't. I've thought a lot about what actually made the difference in all this. Not the attorney, not the forensic examiner, not even the court. It was a 6-sentence email my father sent on a Tuesday afternoon in April, from a man who almost never wrote anything down, to a daughter he wasn't always sure how to love out loud. That email existed because he chose to do the right thing, and I found it because I refused to believe the story I was being handed. There's a version of this where I signed the documents at that kitchen table, where Garrett's voice, flat, certain, practiced, convinces me that fighting would cost more than it was worth. I almost let that happen. I sat in that bathroom with the faucet running and I thought, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm making something out of nothing. Maybe this is just how it goes. But I'd spent 32 years making myself small to keep the peace. And I knew, in the way you know things in your body before your brain catches up, that signing would not bring peace. It would just make the smallness permanent. What carried me through wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves you hollow. What carried me through was something quieter. A decision to trust what I actually knew to be true, even when the person across the table was telling me I was wrong. My father said equal. I heard him say it. I had it in writing. I was not going to let someone rewrite that. Garrett was smart. He had money, connections, a lawyer from Cleveland, and years of practice at being the person in the room who gets what he wants. What he didn't account for was that I am also smart. Just in a different way. In the way that comes from paying attention and keeping records and not throwing things away. The email was in my inbox because I am the kind of person who doesn't delete things. That's not luck. That's a habit built over years of understanding that details matter. And then, there's the part that I think about the most. I kept going when it was hard. There were weeks during the case where I was exhausted in a way I didn't have words for. I was working full days, driving to Akron on weekends, reading legal documents at midnight. Miles would find me on the couch and just sit there, and sometimes that was the only thing that kept the whole structure from collapsing. I didn't stop. Not because I was fearless, but because I understood that stopping was also a choice and I wasn't willing to make it. Garrett made choices too. He chose to forge a signature. He chose to threaten me instead of talk to me. He chose a shortcut that required him to believe I wouldn't look closely enough to find the seam. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequences caught up with him in a courthouse in Akron on a gray October afternoon. The way they tend to when you build something on a lie. My father tried to correct a wrong before he died. Someone tried to undo that correction. I made sure they couldn't. That's the whole story, really. Do the right thing. Use your head. Don't quit. My daughter won't know most of this for years, but she'll grow up in a house that was bought with money her grandfather actually meant for us to have. And maybe someday I'll tell her, your great-grandfather sent one email and your mother saved it, and that was enough.